Okay, here we are, the second one. I'm going to continue reading. Remember, we are reading Bergeron, um, and just kind of in a dry read, seeing what's happening here. That's all right. Remember, the two are sitting on the couch. He's got the buzzing going on in his ears, and Hazel doesn't because she's of average intelligence. So everything's equal for all people, no matter what. He's even got the bird shot around his waist, which I'm assuming is to help even out his weight so that he's average with everything. That's all right, Hazel said to the announcer. He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all of the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was warm, luminous, timeless, melody. Excuse me, she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. Harrison Bergeron, age 14, he said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous. Being under-handicapped here is the idea of being extremely dangerous because he's a genius, he's an athlete, he's kind of got this, that's their idea of extremely dangerous, as someone who, hasn't been handicapped by what in all of this idea for needing equality. A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron, I can't say his last name, was flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. 7 feet tall, wow. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween and hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the HG men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him a wanging headaches besides. So spectacles is another word for glasses. So you can see that it's making him half blind and giving him headaches. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. So the more weight that you have to carry as a handicap. And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. If you see this boy, said the ballerina, do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him. I wonder if they could. There was a shriek of the door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. He's jumping again and again. I wonder if the noise. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well, he might have, for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crushing tune. My God, said George, that must be Harrison. The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clinking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. So simply because his handicaps are removed, now he's deadly? Like, has he proven anything that he's dangerous, or just the fact that now he can think for himself and he's not necessarily worried about the others? Oh, here we go. Never mind. I am the emperor, cried Harrison. Do you hear? I am the emperor. Everybody must do what I say at once. He stamped his foot on the studio shook. What is going on? Even as I stand here, he bellowed, crippled, hobbled, sickened, I am a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become. Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. So what makes him so special, I wonder? Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock that secured his head harness. The bar snapped like celery. Tons of similes in here. Snapped like celery. There's one on the last page. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. I shall now select my empress, he said, looking down on the cowering people. Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet claim her mate and her throne. A moment passed, and then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. Now, said Harrison, taking her hand, shall we show the people the meaning of the word can? Music, he commanded. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. Play your best, he told them, and I will make you barons and dukes and earls. So we're kind of getting into this idea of like promising power to those who obey. So the musicians play their best, they get these, they're going to be dukes and earls and barons. And the ballerina who stands up first, she becomes the empress. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weights to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. Look at that, we got some repetition. Law. And these are like the natural laws here, whereas the ones that are employed, keeping them all equal, are more like the society laws. So interesting. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gamboled, another word for me, sorry, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. Another light, look at that. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing the gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air inches below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the emperor and the empress were dead before they hit the floor. So this is like an extreme consequence. Disobey, death. Because he's almost also showing people what they could be. And so you don't want to give people hope like, well, that's fine. I'll just rip all this stuff off and then it won't be a big deal. Because then if everyone starts doing it, it's easy to control like 2 or 3. But if the whole community starts doing it, how would that work? Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out, probably on purpose. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen. George came back, paused while the handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You've been crying," he said to Hazel. "Yep," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. That's my girl, George said. He winced. There was a sound of a riveting gun in his head. Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy, said Hazel. You can say that again, said George. Gee, said Hazel, I could tell that one was a doozy. So she's saying it again. It saddens me that like their son was just killed and they don't even, I don't know if they don't know, but like what's happening, they can't focus long enough to know someone long enough or to understand something long enough or to, I mean, the television blinks out and then she doesn't know why she's sad. They're not talking about it. I don't know. Um, but it's interesting to start thinking about the fact that, if he is going to, this is what happens when people disobey, is that we're going to make sure that, you have these extreme consequences to follow you along. Okay, so as I'm thinking about this story now, it definitely has that element of equality and like, what if we're all equal, and not just kind of equal, but equal in every sense of the word. And so when I start to think about this piece, you have George and Hazel sitting on the couch, and Hazel doesn't have the handicap because it says that she was of perfectly average intelligence. And so she doesn't have the handicap. George does, but he's almost like, that's just the way it is. Like, even when Hazel says, don't worry about it, you can take it off, he's like, no, not worth the fee. So they're like accepting what's happening in society. And then you have their 14-year-old son, Harrison, is taken away. And I want you to think, like, what about him makes him this threat to society? Like, when you think about his personality traits, what does he threaten to undo or challenge in things? And notice, remember, we just, if you read the lottery, talk about these young folks, we also have this one. He's a 14-year-old son, Harrison. That strikes me because it seems like it's always the younger people who are wanting to make that change and like being bold about it. And so consider that in your thoughts. Like, why would it be that, maybe older people tend to just accept things more so? And not all the time. I'm not saying that. But in a lot of these stories that we read, that's what I'm, as a reader, starting to notice. Something you could do if you're looking for figurative language is to go back and find similes. They're scattered throughout. Like here, they fled in panic like the bandits from a burglar alarm. Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. There's tons and tons of these throughout here, so that could be something to go back for as well. What I want for you to think about is we have George and Hazel's son has been taken, and the handicaps that they have been given or don't have because they're just of average intelligence are so extreme that like they don't remember. I mean, her average intelligence was, which meant that she couldn't think about anything except for in short bursts. And George, while his was way above normal, had a mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it. It tuned to a government transmitter, and every 20 seconds, the transmitters send out some sharp noise to keep people from taking unfair advantage of their brains. Because what happens if people start taking unfair advantage of their brains? They start thinking and maybe doing something. And that the sound that they use in their ears is not like a chime, because remember Hazel said, well, I would use a chime, and he's like, well, I could think through a chime. They're using these panic sounds. They had a gunshot at the end, which think of, why did they have a gunshot at the end? They have these car crash sounds and all kinds of things. So if you go back, you'll notice that the sounds that they're using are not happy sounds. And it also is considering to me like that the brain hadn't changed as much, because those sounds, like, you can't really get used to those sounds. They're always going to have a negative emotional response. So okay, so consider that as you write for this one, the idea of all being equal, and at what point does all being equal, where is that, I don't know about line, but just something to consider. If we're all perfectly equal, what does that mean for an overall society?